So this is the 11th talk on ancient and practical liberation. There will be 12, because an even dozen is a good thing. And my main message in these talks is, like, if we're going to make a t-shirt, it will say, liberation, just do it. Paramitas, just do it. And I mean that on a few different levels. It's like, of course we're bound to misunderstand the Dharma. We are inevitably going to do things a little bit off. That's just what it means to be deluded. Okay? So there's no shame there. And if we hold on to our kind of shame about the mistake that we might make, then it has a potential to kind of wall us off from the opportunity to walk this path of liberation that the Buddha Shakyamuni very selflessly offered to us in this world. In the commentaries on the lives of the ancestors that was written by one of our important ancestors named Keizan Zenji. He was one of the important founders of the school in Japan. In the commentary on Shakyamuni Buddha's life and awakening, has this sentence that always stuck with me. He said, he never spent even one day alone. So after his awakening. He never spent even one day alone. And when I first read that, I thought, oh, surely. He must have escaped from time to time. Well, he's a Buddha. Maybe he doesn't have to do that. But that's his generosity. The Buddha Shakyamuni's awakening was not his opportunity to abandon this world of suffering. It actually was his awakening to the deep transformation of suffering. And this path of the paramitas or the liberations are one way to talk about what it is that he had woken up to and what it is that he was setting in motion as a way of living, a way of being in this world that can lead us beyond the inevitable traps of narrow-mindedness, narrow-heartedness, which is confining and painful. So, because the Buddha never spent even a day alone, even with all these stinky troublemakers, that's you, by the way, me too, then we shouldn't be too worried about that, about the capacity for us to be able to engage the path. It's really available. It takes some effort, but it takes the kind of effort that we were studying the past couple weeks, virya, the kind of vigor that isn't simply aimed at a goal, but you can clearly know what it is, but a kind of steadfastness and energetic engagement with our own problems, right? Our own way of missing it, and being able to receive some generous feedback, which sometimes is difficult, but oftentimes is just really feels liberating very quickly. So, liberation, just do it. Paramitas, just do it. Did you guys ever see that Nike? There was this board up for a while. Yes, it just do it, right? There's another one that says, pain is weakness leaving your body. I remember when I read that, I was like, oh, that sounds like my tradition. And then I thought, maybe that's not so good. But there is a certain image within Zen, and I think it has its place. It also has its excesses and kind of problematic side to it. But there is a place actually when we're encountering pain, we're encountering some difficulty. That is not a bad sign necessarily. Oftentimes we take the difficulty as a bad sign, like I must be making some mistake. But oftentimes if you're orienting in the path, there'll be a side to it which is quite difficult. And that side that's quite difficult to it that's not a bad sign. It's actually can be a good sign that you're there. So difficulty, pain is weakness leaving your body or your mind. So today and next week, I'd like to talk a little bit about the fifth of the liberations or paramitas, concentration or meditation. And There are 6 paramitas or 6 liberations, but each time I've been giving a talk, I've been referring back to the 6th, which is wisdom, and saying that any of the other 5, they're all animated by wisdom. So for any of the other 5, generosity, ethics, forbearance, zeal or vigor or vigorosity, I like to say, because vigor doesn't seem like enough syllables for something so, vigorous. And meditation, that these are all animated by wisdom. And so we're studying wisdom each time when we go back, particularly as we look at those 5 flavors of emptiness that I've been talking about again and again, and how that they find themselves into the way that we are, the way that we act, the way we speak, the way we conceive of the world. And so that's the formulation of those liberations or the paramitas or the perfections. So this week I'd like to start out by talking about what meditation is not. And I'm going to try to not fall into a cynical pit. If I do, please raise your hand and say, Ejo, come out of the pit. I don't think I will. I've been working with this material enough. So over the break, I never quite know what might strike my fancy to study a little bit more. I quite like to read, and in my day-to-day life, with a vigorous temple schedule, I don't have that much time to read. But when we have a recess like we do now, then usually in the morning, rather than getting up and meditating, I get up and I read for an hour or two. And I never know what it is that I might study. It's usually not fiction. I like fiction, but I'm a little bit obsessive about it if I start reading a novel or something. And then there's always some little thread that I'm wanting to pull on, so I start pulling on it. And it took a while, this recess, to kind of form up a bit. But I've been reading a lot from 2 kind of scholarly camps. One is on scholars that study secularization and how it is that our particularly Western society, if you think about Western Europe, North America as being kind of the main places, what was the process through which we've come to the way that we conceive of ourselves now? Not just in religious terms, but really just in all kind of senses of the word. That if you go back several hundred years, you couldn't really find people in Western Europe or Europe in general, who thought of themselves as not being religious. In fact, there wasn't even really the term religious. And so there's a group of scholars that study what was the process that brought us to the way that we think of ourselves now. And very interesting. If you're interested in that kind of thing, Charles Taylor is one of the biggest kind of names in that world. He wrote a very famous book that won a lot of awards called The Secular Age. It's about that thing. The introduction is just great. I find more and more, like, oftentimes I just read the introduction to a book, and then they're going to spend the rest of it proving it. But I usually believe them by the time I've read the introduction. But not so much I'm going to base my whole life on it. If I'm going to base my whole life on it, maybe I'll read the rest of the book. But oftentimes I just kind of want their ideas. So I haven't read the whole book, but I read quite a bit of it. And then there's a lot of other people who are studying this. There's one form of the thesis around secularization, which isn't really in vogue now, but was in vogue for a long time. And that is that it's just obvious that religion will die out. That was the thesis. It's just obvious that now we have a rational way to engage the universe, and we have a scientific method that religion will just dissipate. Because we no longer need the kind of made-up stuff of religion to be able to do the work of making a human life as best as it can be. That thesis, one thing, it just didn't seem to be true. Actually, religion's doing just great. And so that was one side of it. But also there's some particular strands, I won't go into too much, and I might not fall into the cynical pit, but I might fall into an intellectual pit. Sorry about that. There's some strands of studying that are saying, actually, what we call secularization, the secular mindset, really is the Protestant Reformation. It's really a deep Protestant viewpoint about what is true in life. And Charles Taylor, in his work, really studies this clearly. So that's one of the things I've been reading. Another thing I've been reading is about this theory as it applies to Buddhism, particularly Western Buddhism, and oftentimes the poster child / target for people's critique is mindfulness. But Western Buddhism in general is oftentimes also addressed in this kind of work. Okay? So I'm just telling you that that's what I've been studying, because a little bit of what I'm talking about now is going to come out of that. If this kind of thing's interesting to you, Charles Taylor's a good name to remember. Another's a man named Richard Payne, who was a longtime instructor at the IBS, which is the seminary for Shin Buddhist priests in North America. It's in Berkeley. Also very sharp. There's a lot of sharp people on this. So one of the things in this critique of Western Buddhism that is brought up again and again, and I think is really important, and I'm bringing up this today for a particular reason, is that in many ways, in the way that we think about meditation and the way that we encounter meditation in the North American context, is that meditation is made into an instrument of social power. It's made into an instrument to carry out the objectives of neoliberal world order. I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit. Neoliberal world order. Okay. Neoliberal world order is basically a market economy, free market economy world. I'm not going to make a lot of comments on whether that's good or bad. I think it's probably both. But in this way of talking about it, part of the very obvious critique is, oh great, you can use meditation now to feel better about how crappy the world is. How good is that for the people who want to just keep the machine going? That's great. Of course, let's pump out the apps. Let's have a professional development. Let's do all these kind of things. You can feel better about how awful the world is, and we can keep you working, right? We can keep you producing the stuff that people don't really need, which could be sold so that some people can make some profit. Okay, so this is where I can go in the cynical hole pretty quickly. But that is one of the strong critiques of the way that meditation can get instrumentalized, sometimes is the term, or can get commodified. It becomes a unit of exchange within this vast sea of units of exchange, which are all basically equal. We don't have judgment about everything. It's all very groovy. And by the way, could you clock in or clock out? Or actually, we don't clock in or clock out anymore because you are so stress-free that you can work 24 hours a day because you have your iWatch and everything else that's going on. Okay? So there's a strong critique, particularly from leftist intellectuals who are looking at meditation and saying, what is this kind of problem? And I'm hamming it up a little bit there just to kind of make a point. Now, I think that is on the surface. That's something we should really pay attention to. You may have a lot of stresses in your life that have to do with injustice, that have to do with a world that is constructed in a way that is not conducive to human flourishing or spiritual flourishing. And we shouldn't use meditation as a way to convince ourselves that those are okay. That's not the purpose of meditation. Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings were highly radical at his time. One of the reasons that the community was largely made up of renunciates was the renunciates were doing the most radical thing possible at that time and place. They were giving up their family. And giving up their family was not like, oh, I really love my kids, but I'm going to live without them so I can meditate more. Giving up your family was giving up all of your status within the society, all of your ability to have a place of power, comfort, protection, belonging, etc. within the society was all tied up into that. So the Buddha didn't unleash this on the world and say, you guys meditate so you can be better warriors, or you can be better kings, or you can be better whatever. Mostly he was leading a renunciate community. And there were other people who were followers, very important, but that was really a very radical thing that he was doing. So when we start thinking about our own practice of meditation, that's a place to be careful. If you really go into a deep meditation practice, it's going to mess up your life. And what I mean by mess it up is not make it bad, but it's going to call into question a lot of things that you have learned to swallow. Which you needn't. But to not swallow them is not or to learn to not just live with those as the inevitable things, is not just learning to get calm enough that you can put up with those things, right? Actually, learning to meditate deeply will allow you to transform them. And so that's a first thing that we should check. Now, deeper in this thesis, or this way of thinking about things, is a discussion of the closing off of the self. So basically this way of thinking about it is through this process of secularization, through the establishment of the kind of way the world is now, we closed our sense of self. We became an individual that was primarily responsible for their own self, disembedded from community and disembedded from a larger spiritual world that informs how it is that you live. And this is a very kind of nuanced and complex thing. I won't go on about it too long, but I want to refer to one of the things I've been talking about in all of these classes, which is these talks, is that one of the fundamental misunderstandings that we have is that we are a subject in a world of objects, and that we walk around encountering phenomena, but all those phenomena that we encounter are actually also subjects. They are beings. And that what we're shifting with our application of wisdom is how do we start to encounter things as being alive, as not just being the objects of my subject. So what happens in this closing off, where we become very individual, oftentimes we get driven to spiritual practices by this idea that my individuality needs saved in some way. And you can hear this in the way that we talk about meditation in the popular culture, like, oh, I'm so stressed out, I need to learn to meditate. Now, I can tell you, Buddha didn't leave us alone. Buddha will help you with your stress, right? That will happen. We'll talk more about that later. But notice the way the narrative is, which is your responsibility to take care of your stress. It's your responsibility to take care of your mental health. It's something that you need to do as an individual. And you know what? We can kind of tell who's been saved and who hasn't been saved by how much you weigh. Just to cut in real deep there. Okay. I'm not doing so great in that realm. But that's the mentality that I'm asking you to dig out in your own mind as you approach meditation. It's not the way for you to whoop yourself into shape, particularly not to whoop yourself into shape in the way that this neoliberal agenda wants you to whip yourself into shape. Right? That's the point that I'm making here. This commodified way that we live now in industrial society is deeply harmful, not only to the planet, we're all becoming quite aware of that more and more, but the organism of the planet and the organism of our humanity are completely inseparable. Whatever kind of issues you're having with stress or mental health or those things cannot be separated from the overall calamity of what humans are doing. Can't separate it, right? And so when we try to take up meditation, for example, to try to find a little peace, yes. But also, whatever kind of peace you're finding there cannot be separated from the larger world. And that's the place where I think this critique is the most important and sharp, and gives us a really clear avenue about what we're doing with meditation. Meditation is not about going off by yourself and getting it together, i.e. Zen Community Temple. There's a reason that we articulate this institution in the way that we do. Not because you'll never meditate by yourself, or not because meditating by yourself is not a good thing. It is. But if you think you're meditating by yourself, as if that was even possible, you've missed something. There's no such thing as meditating by yourself. My teacher was very fond. He would always say, Tenchi Bambutsu Ittai ni naru. That's what this sitting is. Heaven, earth, 10,000 things one body. That's how he would describe Zazen. If he was giving Zazen instruction, he didn't instruct you very much. But he will say, you sit like this, and then he would say, heaven and earth, 10,000 things, one body. Now that you have sat, you have to sit every day for the rest of your life, or it means you have never sat before. That was his other time and space. He had those both. In the instruction. Right? So trying to make ourselves better with meditation, in addition to having all of these it works well within a society that wants you to be functional for its own ends. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to our own healing and things getting better, but we should just be careful about what is the underlying motivation. Because if we don't pay attention to that frame, that frame which asks us to become a very kind of almost radically subjective, then meditation can be further isolating, and it become further dominating. Both your capacity to dominate yourself, but also if you start listening to the rhetoric of here and now, it starts sounding like a pill that somebody wants to give you to require you to feel okay about calamity. The here and now is not about you being able to relinquish all difficulties that have ever happened or are happening right now. If you're really touching into the here and now, suffering will be part of it. And that's what we were studying when we were talking about forbearance. At the base of forbearance, of those different kinds of forbearance we talked about, was the receptivity to suffering. Is necessary. If it's not in there in your meditation, there's something off. So this is to help you. I just got something from Lion's Roar. I always feel so conflicted about this. I'm on their email list, and I got a little thing, and so they have a 5-day workshop, and it's very carefully curated, just 30 minutes each day. They make that really clear in the advertisement. It's just only 30 minutes. That's all it takes. That's very specific time. There'll be 5 famous teachers. Expert teachers, and there'll be 20 minutes of meditation, there'll be 10 minutes of question and answer, and you get to do it with other people. And they're really emphasizing, because we're coming together. Online, right? But coming together. And so the reason I feel conflicted about this, I'm like, hallelujah. People aren't thinking like, yeah, just go in my hole and meditate, and that's what it's supposed to be about. Great, move. But also you can see in the whole process this sort of, okay, together? Am I actually together with these people? And I don't mean just because you're only on virtual, visual, and audio, but I mean, are my life entangled with this in a person which I'm going to be receptive to their suffering? That's possible in those kind of environments. Right? It's not guaranteed. It's possible in these kind of environments, not guaranteed. Right? So we have to ask ourselves those questions, right? What does it mean to be together? What does it mean for the heaven, earth, and the 10,000 things to be one body in the face of meditation? I think for humans up until the modern age, that has meant community. It has meant ritual. It has meant a investment that we make together in trying to be related to something which is not only on a kind of horizontal plane, but also is on a vertical plane. Right? In a Christian sense, they would call that transcendent. But in a Buddhist sense, we would say awakening. We'd say the Buddha actually woke up to something. Right? And we should keep that in mind. It's not that practical. Right? But it has a very practical face. So the reason I bring this up is that we're all under this framing. You can't be alive in North America or have been here for very long and not have this framing pretty firmly as the lens with which you are looking at things, at least some of the time. And that's why I call it out, just to say that we should be aware that that's in there and we should be sensitive for it. That's why I say I want to talk about what dhyana is not, or what meditation is not. Now, these kind of critiques are nothing new. or critique in general is nothing new. Always the framing that we will give to something which is so subtle and profound as wisdom, as meditation, as what the Dogen Zenji referred to as the unsurpassed, unfabricated, wondrous art. The unsurpassed, unfabricated, wondrous art. That's what he called Zazen, right? Not meditation, right? Unsurpassed, unfabricated, wondrous art. If that's what we're talking about, there's always going to be a critique, because our framing is always going to be limiting the way we think about it. Dogen's time, framing was limited. A lot of monks were running around being like, I'm going to become enlightened. Morality doesn't matter very much. I'm just going to... and he's like, whoa, guys. We need to rethink that, right? And so he had a strong critique of the way that people were understanding meditation, the framing that they were giving to meditation at the time. And this happens all the time. So the reason I bring this up is that part of our own process of engaging these practices is to develop our own capacity to critique. And that's not about critiquing the mindfulness a mindfulness app, which is super easy to do, right? But isn't actually very helpful. You just take your own angst about it and you project it onto something else, and then you can feel superior. I've done that a lot of times. That's why I know how easy it is to do. So you want to be careful of that. It's not about judging things out there. That's not why I bring this up. I think people get teachings from all kind of places you can't even imagine. I remember the first translation of Shobo Genzo that I was given, Dogen Zenji's collection of essays that are completely beyond comprehension. The translation's awful. Really, it's like, oh man. And then I went to retreat with Kyogen Carlson Roshi, who used that translation, and he liberated our minds with that translation. Like, unbelievably. And I was like, oh, okay, Ejo, get off your high horse, take it down from the shelf where you relegate it to the bad translations of Shobo Genzo or whatever. You see, the Buddha didn't leave us alone. The Buddha didn't leave that translator alone. The Buddha doesn't leave us alone. It's there. So in this critique, it's not a critique to become cynical, it's not a critique to make yourself better, it's none of those things, but it's a sharpening of your mind to say, what am I really doing here? At the same time as saying that Zazen is the true gate of this unsurpassed, unfabricated, wondrous art, Dogen also said that this Zazen is not meditation practice. So here's one of Dogen's critiques. He said, if you think about it as meditation practice, you're missing the point. In Japanese, he said, Shuzen ni arazu. Shuzen. Shu means to learn, and zen means dhyana or meditation. Arazu means not. So shuzen ni arazu means it's not learning meditation. So here's a critique here about people's framing. Menzan, this is a great one, the big revivalist of the Soto school, he said, this Zazen is not the fifth liberation or the fifth paramita of the six paramitas. Now here I'm talking about meditation, right? I'm talking about it as Zazen, but Menzan said, no, that's not it. Right? When I talk about Zazen, I'm not talking about the meditation of the liberations. Now, I don't want to go into those too much. Next week I might a little bit. But the purpose is just to say this kind of critique is part of our tradition. And so if I were to say this, I would say mindfulness or meditation or Zazen is not for the purposes of fixing you. Healing's a different issue. So even though we will stumble into these things with these kind of mistakes, these kind of misconceptions about what we're doing, it's really no big worry. It's worth bringing up, but don't do it to worry you. You have the medicine of wisdom, the prajna paramita. That medicine to say, oh, okay, there's no concrete permanent self. Everything comes and goes. Things are not even what I think they are when I perceive them. So how does that bear on this situation? I know that everything is deeply interconnected. How does that bear on the situation? I know that I can't leave myself out as an observer. I'm totally part of it. How does that bear on the situation? I know that things are fundamentally just simply what they are, neither coming nor going. How does that bear on the situation? I am thoroughly engaged with the whole universe. How does that bear on the situation? So if we take something like this critique of a modern idea of meditation, which is saying, do these things and maybe do them with other people, do them by yourself, and cultivate your own healthy body and mind by yourself with these things, and that's what meditation is about. Well, just think about the second of those wisdoms. All things are completely interpenetrated. How could you be doing that on your own? How could you be getting whole and healthy and whatever in a separate place from the rest of the world? How could your community remain so convoluted and you be kind of happy? That's not how it goes, right? Actually, if you're going to practice it, those sufferings of your community, of your world, are going to be there with you. And that now your meditation has a depth it didn't have in terms of just how quiet did my mind get, something like that. So we can apply these things, and as we apply them, what we'll see is whatever it is that we're kind of questioning or paying attention to, when we apply the eye of wisdom to it, it will point us back to compassion. And we're coming back to this again and again. That the sixth paramita, the paramita of wisdom, is actualized through the first five paramitas, right? Which we could also refer to as compassion. And that's a place where we have to function. If you're only functioning in one realm, which is going to cut off from other things, you're not really doing it. And this is why that kind of modern sense of the isolated self is so toxic. And why you can see people are waking up to, they're like, wait a minute, I don't think I can survive in a world where I just live in this house with a garage with my car that goes in and out and my fence, in which I don't know the neighbors, and I connect with people online, sort of, but I don't really know my embeddedness within the world because I'm closed off. That's not just something that happens to some people. That is an overall framing of our society now. Meditation is not just something to help you heal. It's something to transform society. It's something that can shift the dynamic of how it is that we are as one of many kinds of beings on the planet and in the universe. So that's where I would say this wisdom teaching especially is a medicine for that kind of closed off sense. And as we practice meditation, which I'll go into next week more, the practice of meditation, these things, they become clear. Even probably the first time you meditate, even you just sit down for a few minutes, your mind gets a little bit quiet, and then you turn and you see something, and you see it in a totally different way. You're like, whoa. Like that itself is pretty radical, This kind of shift from the use value of things to their existential value. A shift from them being useful or noticeable to you because they fulfill something. Now I'm going to have a drink of water. But I can shift from that kind of relationship with them to that their existence has its own value. That's called appreciating the personhood of whatever it is that you're encountering. Right? And meditation does that in a very simple, consistent way, inside and outside of yourself. Sometimes what you need is hard, but it's still a person. A little time for questions or comments.
Can you say something about the difference between fixing and healing?
Yeah. So, this is I'm sort of using a framing, and those words could get used in a lot of different ways, but the way that I'm using them is, sometimes we do need to fix things. They're broken, there's like a bolt that's broken, we can go in, we can take out the bolt, and we can put in another bolt, and then the thing functions. I'm using kind of mechanistic metaphor here on purpose. So there is that way of looking at the world, like it's mechanistic, and we can do very specific things to make the thing work. But I'd say it's rarely that simple. It's rarely that mechanized. Most things are much more organic. And so if you think about like a tree loses a limb in the ice storm, there's no way to fix that. But you could help support healing of the tree so that it doesn't have further disease that might create other problems in the tree, for example. The tree's also not going to lose the markings of that difficult happening. That's not what the healing will do. The healing won't remove all evidence that there has ever been any problem. So if we take those two kind of images as a way of difference between fixing and healing, when we're thinking about meditation and thinking about how I do want to make some changes through my life, not just for me, but for my community, for my family, for the world, that's all really helpful. But oftentimes we think about it with that mechanistic mindset. Like if I just insert the 15 minutes of meditation each day, that then it'll be like replacing the bolt and everything will work smoothly. And I think oftentimes that's kind of what gets sold to us, or we have a framing to see it that way. And if we talked about healing, especially this thing about marking, the wounds of your life will not just go away. They're not supposed to go away. Healing doesn't make them go away. It makes them heal. And the mark may still be there. And hopefully it will be, because it's a source of wisdom and compassion for you to have that part of yourself. But the healing is supported through a process which includes the wholeness of that tree, as opposed to, I'm just going to take this one bolt out and put another bolt in. And I think we're much more that way. So if we think about a meditative practice as being healing, it's asking us first to feel the wholeness of our own individual being. But the only way to feel the wholeness of our own individual being is to also be receptive to the wholeness of being itself. And that's the place where the healing can be engendered. And then we're not looking at our difficulties just as problems to kind of swap out. We're looking at our difficulties as an opportunity for maturation and healing that can then make us wiser about how to live.
Yeah, so healing includes the receptivity that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like,
Yeah. And I think that's the part which is really, although I was speaking a little harshly today, I think we're actually we're very lucky, because more and more people are waking up to talking about, actually, there's something called togetherness. There's something called inseparability. There's something about our life in which I can't just divide myself out or anything easily. And that's where so much of the healing is happening. If you take, for example, the massive rise in the mental health, I don't know if I'm supposed to say industry or not, that's not such a nice word, but that, the world of mental health. And this is my suspicion, is it's going to continue to go up for a certain place, and we're going to make some social changes, and it will come down a little bit. It won't become unimportant, but that the big rise in need for mental health services is also really in relation to a whole humanity, like a whole situation of humanity right now. But what are people doing in that process? One of the main things they're doing is they're talking with another person about really important things. They're getting out of their individual shell of holding the pain and difficulty of their life as an individual unit. Because so many people now are not embedded in these larger things. Even if you are embedded in larger things, I'm not saying that you wouldn't go to a therapist or something like that. That could be very helpful. But because of this deep kind of closing, I believe it's become important, because the healing comes from that receptivity, that move this way and move this way, which is just as natural to us as breathing. That our consciousness moves this way and this way at the same time. It's just as natural as breathing. But we don't have a relationship with it that's so good. Yeah. We don't have a relationship with our breathing that's so good too much of the time. And the two kind of go together. The way we breathe and the way we conceive of things. Mm-hmm.
Continuing that train of thought, you talked about the personhood of objects, and healing, and I was using some plastic spoons last night, and feeling my sorrow for these objects. Someone had brought them, and we used them, and we ate food with them, but just like, this is like a hurting thing, and it's in my life. And so oftentimes as a priest, someone will say, oh, I like Buddhism because they're just simple about everything. And it's like, oh, you don't know my tradition. And we put such deep care into objects. And I'm feeling a kind of shift in the minimalist kind of like, right, just be easy with your things, towards like, have things that you love and bring beauty. And where does that guide your intention for this temple and this community and how we live together?
So one of my greatest joys is when people are here and I'm kind of showing them around. Well, we'll just try it out. What was your name again? Yeah.
Alita.
Alita, point to something in the room.
Oh.
Anything. You just choose it. Which thing?
The vase.
The vase there. That was brought to me by my Dharma brother in 2003, along with many of the ritual implements that you will see. And he went to a Buddhist supply store called Nakaido, which is in Sendai, and they supply a lot of the temples in that area. And he talked with the guy who owns the shop, whose name I can't remember, but I can see his face. And he said, oh, my Dharma brother's starting a temple in Eugene, and this is about the size of it, this is what it's kind of look like, and I want to bring him the basic things that he'll need to be able to burn the altar. And he said, oh yeah, let's look at these. And they chose these ones, and then they shipped him here, and then he came and helped me unpack them. And there was not such a big song at that time, and we've been using them ever since. I can do that with anything you point to in this room. Really, literally. And some of them much more complicated than that, right? And so that's my vision, is that now I can do that in this particular room because I've been so here for so long. And you could do it with many, many, many things in this room. That's actually how simple it is that we live in that way. And and we live in a way to care for things, to know and recognize where they come from, where they're going, and what is the fullness of that life. And I oftentimes have a really hard time if I'm, visiting other places and there's a lot of plastic spoons and plastic and all those kinds of things. And it used to be really stumbling point for me. I always carry around my own spoon and my own chopsticks, and I always try to have my own bowl. I always tried to do that. And maybe that would be good if we all did that. I'm not cutting that out as a positive thing for us to do. But what I also started doing, which I think holds the same spirit, is I say little prayer for those things when I throw them away. And by little, I mean I touch them to my forehead. That's how long the prayer is. But that kind of recognition that a plastic spoon does have the life of a plastic spoon. And there is suffering in that. There is a contraction in that, as there's a contraction in all lives. And also that, there is the life of that spoon, which is the life of that spoon. How are we going to respect it and care for it? That becomes an interesting question. Whereas oftentimes when we're just engaged in the kind of political side of it, we think there shouldn't be plastic spoons. Plastic spoons are an abomination, right? And so you're feeling into something different, which is like, oh no, the plastic spoon has its own beingness. It's not just a war against plastic spoons, right? Plastic spoons aren't the problem. Plastic hearts are the problem. And so what is the way that we overcome that? And one of the really, I encourage people in that vein, one of the really sweet things about that kind of life, and I know this is something that you practice and are learning more and more about, is your life is filled with meaningful things. Because meaning comes from relationship with other beings, as opposed to objects that are instruments of your subjectivity. There's no meaning in that. You see how you can't get meaning out of that? Just like something being treated as an object doesn't provide any meaning. It's not possible. It could give you data, it could give you information, but it can't give you meaning. And so when you relate to things in this other way, then meaning flows through your life, and that's super cool.
Yeah. I wanted to ignite, rekindle some energy from when I first came here when I was 26 or so. I really appreciate the talk. And Genjo's question, I feel like hits a little bit at some of my first critiques of this practice, which is like, yes, we have this regard for the things around us, but we're all burning gasoline and eating meat to get here. How do we, and I kind of asked this question on behalf of Remy when he asked me this in 10 years. How do I defend this practice that I have a certain idea of supporting mutual awakening, but I feel like we still have these blinders on? Personally, I try to answer that question in terms of what's practical and what I can affect in this world. So I appreciate that, but I'm curious to hear your response.
Well, I would say more and more, I don't meet many people who I think have blinders on. I mean, of course we have blinders on, but I mean, generally speaking, I don't think most people are in the stick our head in the sand phase of the whole thing. I think there's more willful ignorance or willful not paying attention, which is also practical, right? Because you're like, okay, I got to get my kids to school, and so I can try to, like, and my kids are out of the house and stuff now, so I don't think about it, but when they went to school, it would be like, okay, I could get a bicycle, and we could leave at 6:30 in the morning, and we may arrive there by social, or we could move across town to be close to their school, unless of course they move schools, which is what happened. And then, so you can get in this place, and then pretty soon, maybe you're trying really hard. Maybe you're one of these people that's really like, I'm vegan, and I never ride in a motorized vehicle, and I don't ever turn the heat on, and I'm diminishing everything. Even there, you're kind of in this kind of constant constrictive cycle. And so I think that everyone is in that kind of process. The people that I meet, generally speaking, I feel like are in that kind of process. Where I would point you is to come back to maybe the central point of this talk is that the Buddha doesn't leave us alone. That a tradition like this is not made up only of the things that it does well. It's made up of the places that need critique. And that critique will happen at any given time, like within this time, but over time too. We could critique that, like when Remy in 10 years was like, hey Dad, how come you were driving us over, except you do come on a bicycle, driving us over to the temple or whatever, about that. That critique will be there and should be there. So I think we need to take that to heart. One of the things that I'm very concerned about, and I think it's one of the reasons that we really need the religious institutions to become more robust and to speak about meaning in a more powerful way, is that the narrative that we are in about the destruction of the planet is itself a tool of this kind of nihilistic, neoliberal direction. And so the amount of times that we say to our kids, this is an existential threat, climate crisis, all of those very loaded words, which sometimes are appropriate, that, in my opinion, is itself a way to undermine meaning. And if you talk with young people today, the level of nihilism and the level of complete disconnection from meaning is astounding. I think we're an equal problem there. Not only because that itself is so crushing of our being, but because it won't lead to better stewardship of the planet. And that we need to find ways to talk about a meaning-based way of living and stewardship that is meaningful in how we live. Will that include the destruction of some things? Will that include killing? It will include killing. Will it include some things get destroyed for other things to get lifted up? It will include that. And so, but if we just hammer on that it itself has become a kind of placeholder for meaning for people. How do I know who I am? Well, because I know the world's going to hell, and I'm a person who's trying to do something about it. And so we just talk about that incessantly. And I think that that's a place that, I would point you to also look at, that we need that to be cared for as well as the physical pieces. And that's always a kind of messy process, And I don't think there's any really simple, untouched moral ground to be on in that terrain. One interesting thing, I went to figure out my carbon footprint, and I was like, I'm gonna figure this out, blah, 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 blah. And then when I was like, oh, just by the virtue of living in North America, I'm already way past. If I just didn't do anything, I'm still way past, just because of the infrastructure that's here. And we're pretty good in the Northwest because we have so much hydroelectric, but hydroelectric has its own problems, and we're trying to take that down. And so that's also a kind of place of deep reflection. I think we need. I'm going to let Carl speak because we need to stop here in a second. I know we're talking about ecological stuff, and he's kind of the ringleader of the Eco Dharma group. So
I think when you said that there's no simple high moral ground here,
yeah.
I think that's true, and it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
I think that at the heart of your the message of the Dharma talk this morning, of when we sit to do Zazen, we are not alone,
Mm-hmm.
and that if we understand and try to practice that idea of we are not alone,
Mm-hmm.
lots of things come from it.
Yeah.
I think one of the most significant things that come from it, when we look at the various features of our broken world,
Mm-hmm.
as we're waking up to the challenges in front of us, I think most of us, myself included, we tend to take those challenges on in a very individual way.
Yeah.
What can I do today?
Yeah.
What can I do with my car, my life, my house, my insulation,
Yeah.
whatever?
Yeah.
But I think the message of we are not alone is actually part of the answer.
Yeah.
That the response is, there's no way we can do it alone.
Mm-hmm.
We can't, like you said, we're born into North America.
Yeah.
We're already on the wrong side of the equation.
Yeah.
We can't do it alone.
Yeah.
I think if it's an invitation then to take the idea of this practice as Zazen in understanding our togetherness,
Yeah.
it also is a form of guidance to what kind of action can we take that is about recognizing and honoring our togetherness.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very powerful kind of connection.
Yeah, 100%. And I like the way you framed that. It both is and is not a moral high ground. If we use the language of the Prajnaparamita, the Bodhisattva has no place to stand. And the Bodhisattva has no place to stand because all beings are included in the activity of the Bodhisattva. And so it can't be a place to stand. And if we want to really understand ethics, like in a second perfection, that's what ethics flows from. It's not a place of ethics. And I think so often when we're thinking in that individualistic way, it's what we're trying to do. We're kind of trying to save our own butt. I want to be able to turn to my kid in 10 years and be like, I had a Prius, you know, or whatever. I know that I pick on Priuses a lot, but that's because I know a lot of you drive them. And I think that's a good thing, by the way. But it's not a moral high ground. And it is.